Pokemon Generation 1's development was a lengthy and rapidly changing procedure. Starting as early as 1990 by the title of Capsule Monsters, many concepts and designs were made, changed, and even cut in the final game. But one of these changes was much more of an aesthetic and thematic change. This, of course, I'm referring to, is the ever-evolving beta designs of the game. From trainers, maps, and even Pokemon changed heavily to the final incarnations we have today. So today on Cut Content, we explore the beta designs of Pokemon Red and Blue. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell too to further support us and keep creating new videos. The beta designs, as mentioned earlier, started as early as 1990 and kept evolving till before the game released. As such, there are for the most part a minimum of 2 or 3 different designs for many of the elements of the game. Now at the very beginning, the concept of a Pokemon trainer and its relationship to its Pokemon was very different. While they were still traveling together and the Pokemon were used to battle, they were more tamers than trainers at this early stage. This was because Pokemon weren't treated as much like a pet-like fashion, but much more as a tool of battle, considering if one looks at this early art of Red in a Pokemart, you can clearly see Pokemon caged up and even in a bottle. But this doesn't even go to the full extent of it, as some Pokemon trainers in fact used whips to tame their Pokemon at this stage of development. Which, if we start off, I'd like to present a very early sprite of the player character Red, who unlike his final tame art, carries a whip and appears very serious in the sport of taming Pokemon. While in the final game, the only people to carry a whip are Team Rocket Grunts, Cool Trainers, and Sabrina, all of which either treat Pokemon more as a business or take the sport way too seriously. While here in this concept art, we see Red even facing a trainer who is whipping his Pokemon mid-battle to do his bidding. Now, while we have a beta version of an existing trainer here, a number of trainer classes that exist in the final game in fact replaced older ones altogether, which we'll look at now. The first one is one called Student, which was replaced by Cool Trainer Female. The pose still looks similar, but this one looks a lot tamer without the whip. Next is Firefighter, a class that in no way exists in the final game, but the internal data shows this was replaced by the Psychic Trainer class. And one of the most interesting ones is one called Shinjuku Jack, which was replaced by the Juggler class. While this class is strange on its own as it looks kinda like a robot, the strangest thing about this class is that it has the name of a real-life city, Shinjuku, in its name. Now, as many of you know, the Kanto region is based on the real-life Kanto region of Japan, and Celadon City is in fact the equivalent to Shinjuku. So it is possible that Shinjuku Jack was in fact faced in Celadon City. Now there are 2 other cut trainer classes here, which is hard to say what they are exactly for. Some believe this one might have been a beta Brock, as his design looks a lot like Brock, except his hair isn't so spiky. While with this one, some believe it might have been your rival's brother, based on a naming convention, but nothing is concrete. Now the most interesting of these finds is a cut gym leader known as Yujiro. The artist Sugimori released artwork of his original 8 gym leaders in the order that you were supposed to face them. The interesting part is that Brock isn't the first gym leader in this, but rather it is Yujiro. It is very likely that Yujiro was to be the Viridian gym leader back then, and thus you wouldn't have to skip over the gym just to come back to it at the end. In fact, to further link this to Viridian Gym, let's compare his sprite to Giovanni's sprite. They have an eerily similar pose and expression at that too. While the inspiration is clear, one might even think that they simply aged up Yujiro into this Yakuza/Mafia boss. While I have previously shown this in another video, going further amongst the Sugimori gym leader photos, Blaine is shown with his beta design as an older military man, a design that stayed even into the manual of the first games, and even in the anime. And going to the last of the beta's gym leader order, we can actually see that Sabrina was originally meant to be the final gym leader of the batch, considering Giovanni didn't exist at this point either. Now rolling back to Red, he has a second sprite. It's hard to say why there were two different sprites in the beta stage for him, but it could be his sprite changes as you progress through the game, or it's just a part of the opening animation for the game. Also, we even have a matching back sprite for both of these sprites too. Up till now, all these sprites and many others that I plan to introduce come from a leak of Pokemon Red and Green, introduced by the Helix Chamber. And so, with that leak, we got this overworld sprite sheet that includes a character that we've never seen before. In fact, if we compare it to Red Sprite, it looks very similar, almost like it's a female variant of him. Now, while I have covered the cut female trainer extensively in a previous video, it seems this leak gave us a lot more insight on this matter. Originally in the concept arts of the game, we saw a lot of Red going about his journey, but one other character also appeared prominently throughout these concept arts. Her design in fact matches up very well with the sprite here, only further proving that a female playable character was indeed a thing. She did of course eventually get a redesign to appear unique from Red, rather than be a female Red in this case, but even that variation was scrapped until it reappeared in Let's Go remakes. But of course, you all want to see the Pokemon themselves, I imagine. While I have previously covered cut Pokemon in a different video that happened during the stage, which I highly recommend you check after this video, this covers the beta version of existing Pokemon, which can look anywhere from kinda similar to absolutely different. Let's start off with Venusaur, which at this point was actually called by Ivysaur's Japanese name, Fushigiso, which may indicate that the Bulbasaur line may have been only a two-stage evolution at this stage. And in comparison to the Japanese-only Red and Green releases, it looks a lot more shriveled up. Hilariously, when compared to the blue version that we got here, it looks as if Venusaur just got healthier and healthier. But moving to Clefairy, it had at least two beta designs. The first of which having a more simple and not so cute of a design, which by 92 and 93 started to shape to look closer to the final design. The interesting thing about this first design is that its design really feeds into the theory of Gengar being Clefairy's shadow, especially with the beta design more or less having the same pose and shape too. With that, let's move on to Gengar, which while resembling beta Clefairy, not having its signature green is the first thing that comes to one's mind, which adds a further simplicity that beta Clefairy also had. They both definitely diverged by 92-93 once they started coming closer to their final designs. Now, another with their mouth altered is Grimer, who lacks his happy open mouth and looking a lot sadder here in fact. Definitely starting to cheer up down the road, which while the 92-93 photo is blurry as can be, there also does appear to be some indication of a mouth here. But the next major design difference is Spearow, which at its earliest stage looks quite pudgy in comparison to its final slim build, and in fact looks a lot more like a real-life Sparrow with that build, which I always found the name kinda strange considering how its final form looked. Much like Spearow resembling its real-life counterparts, Seal also had a beta form that looked more like a real-life Seal, with its flatter body and many spots on its body too. Seems a trend happened to go further away from real-life animals here considering both Seal and Spearow change. But also a lot like Spearow, Scyther in its beta form had a much chubbier body and looked a lot less menacing too, while carrying a simpler design. I'd be curious how this would have looked as a Scizor. Now we come to Cloyster, who in comparison to its final design, looks as though it's missing its outer shell, where all its large horns stick out. Then we get to the Poliwag line. While Poliwhirl looks more or less like its final incarnation, Poliwag is missing a part of its tail. Now Poliwrath, however, looks quite a bit different, having what appears to be a mouth here and sporting a crown that looks a lot like the King's Rock. It's possible that the King's Rock was in fact conceived based off this design in Generation 2 that led to the creation of Politoed. Now let's talk about Gyarados. It's already made out to be a scary sea serpent. Here, it's what fuels nightmares with its circular body, mouth, and sharp teeth while lacking eyes. Easy to understand why it was changed considering it looked like a mythical sandworm except in water. Coming to Lapras, in its beta design, it lacked ears, and in fact, this exists beyond sprite form too, as we have a piece of concept art, and of course, we have Dragonair, who while it is a similar shape, was one solid color as opposed to its dual tone as it normally appears. It also has scales coming down its back too. Personally, it's a form I quite prefer as opposed to its elegant dragon snake form that we got in the final game. Now, the next batch are rather similar to their final designs, but have some major differences to them. First off is Nidoking, who while his sprite had him with his back facing the player, shows a major difference of his tail having horns running all the way down, as opposed to his final design having horns stopping at his back. Then we have Lickitung, who didn't have its stomach stripes, and its tongue seemingly split at the ends in quite a horrifying manner. And much like Lickitung, Arcanine also lacked its stripes. Tentacool had a very minor difference. If one zooms all the way in, they would see that it has a tiny mouth as opposed to the final game's version, which has no mouth. And then we have Rhyhorn and Rhydon. Rhyhorn has a much simpler design, lacking much of its sharp body and looking much less menacing, while Rhydon simply has a normal horn as opposed to its signature horn drill like the final version. But the biggest difference to top all these is the Weedle line. While Weedle looked quite simple in comparison to its final appearance, its evolutions were entirely different Pokemon pretty much. Both Kakuna and Beedrill looked a lot more cartoonish. In fact, Kakuna had 2 arms coming from it from the get-go, and I'm not sure if Beedrill at this point was a bee even, but more of a ladybug or even a cockroach with 4 hands. Imagine having a bug and fighting type in first generation. While there are other Pokemon designs from the earlier stages, most are more or less one-to-one to their final designs. Now, aside from trainers and Pokemon, the other major element is the overworld of Kanto. The maps they designed come in 5 stages. Originally, it was a simple concept loosely based on the real-life Kanto region, except there was a desert there too at one point. Seems the variety was definitely going to be a more traditional JRPG at that point. But the next stage comes in this very simple map design of how all the cities and maps are to be laid out. Very similar to the final games, except there is an island smack in the middle, which I have covered extensively in a previous video that I highly recommend you check out after this. Afterwards, we have the first in-game map of the overworld, which looks very archaic. The routes all have their numbers placed right into the map using tall grass. As well, the sprite sets were very different at this stage, with the overworld looking more like a traditional retro RPG actually. There even is an inn at this point. The maps overall were very simple, and not a single cave was around too. Fuchsia City was also a bit longer with a dock area, and that island from earlier had its first and only in-game map here too, which contains the same truck from the St. Anne's Out of Bound map, where you would supposedly get Mew if you use strength on the truck. And lastly comes the map that precedes the final game's map, and it's using the final tile set at last. Some cities and routes are unfinished here, or just not simply made. In fact, to represent tall structures, they simply stacked one-story houses on top of each other. Saffron City especially looks odd, as it appears to have this massive island in the middle, and everything between Fuchsia City, Cinnabar Island, and Pallet Town appears to be solid ground in this build rather than long stretches of water that we got in the final game. Now to end this, let's go to the very beginning with the title of Capsule Monsters. As mentioned, Capsule Monsters was the original title prior to the change to Pocket Monsters due to trademark issues. And so we have this clean image of the logo, which clearly shows off what would become a Pokeball later, or rather, it was a capsule that held Pokemon back then. But when it became Pocket Monsters, it received a new logo that is still different from the final games. Looks more in line with the final style of the game, however, and seems Rhydon was going to be quite the titular character back then too, which is no surprise as it was one of the earlier designed Pokemon. And with 5 years of development and numerous changes, we got an industry-defining game made all through trial and error and launching a craze to the world. While there are features I would have loved to have seen, such as the female trainer or Cut Island, the final game's end results are a masterpiece. While the last Pokemon Gen 1 video was a while back, it definitely needed to be revisited again to truly complete what we set out to do. If more Pokemon Generation 1 content comes to light, I'll definitely plan to cover it. Otherwise, Generation 2 is upon us, so hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Pokemon and other games cut content too. Hit the like button too, and comment below on what beta designs you like best. So everyone, thank you for watching!